Hello, hello. I suppose this is a voice reveal as I narrate through my design process for my current project, Warriors of Six Strings. I would like to first apologize for the quality of the footage. Unfortunately, the Procreate app does not have a very good speed paint recording feature. And I will also like to apologize for the quality of the sound. I am simply recording this off the cuff on my iPad. So the way this will go is that I will first talk about the general design as a whole, and then dive into each character more in detail. So the initial design intent here was to represent one mage from each magic faction from my world. Obviously, this is an exercise in world building, so the guiding principle here was to imagine the most stereotypical mage from each of my mage factions that I have. So I began with drawing out the silhouettes and roughly sketching out the pose I wanted and the rough, cut of cloth that I wanted for each of these characters, and writing down some notes about what I wanted for these designs. So I want to admit that my design process is pretty terrible. It is not professional at all. These designs are basically a one-take design. Whereas when you're trying to do professional quality design work, well, you want more than one take. You would do many designs, you would try many types of designs before settling down on your final version. But here I am simply just sketching out basically the first idea that came to mind. I personally feel quite confident when I design because I think a lot about what I want. I do a lot of research beforehand, and in this case I had a very specific vision about it. So the process of trying different designs and erasing them, well, it happens in my head, and also happened when I was writing down the design elements I wanted. Something somewhat special for this design process was that every single design was made on a single canvas. So they were all side by side as I drew them. And this is to make sure that the designs remain coherent between each other, right? So even though these mages come from different cultures, they have different spiritual beliefs, they still belong in the same world. So I draw them side by side so that there is some sort of coherence between each and every one character. This is something many beginner artists, they neglect to do when they're trying to design their characters, especially for a full cast of characters. This is something you should avoid. So designing individual characters separately, because they might not fit together in terms of design, and you will sometimes forget things and miss out on having a connective tissue between every single design. And here, even though this is not necessarily a cast of characters, we do have a connective tissue. The connective tissue here is the question of what makes a mage, visually speaking. And well, the answer is simple. The clothing. Big, long drapes, right? When you think about a wizard, you always think about people with long robes, and you will see that here, every single one of these mages have long flowy drapes or a long flowy skirt. And this is entirely intentional, and I will explain a little bit more as we go into, our first design. So the Sorolla, the Sunlight Sister, is obviously inspired by the Catholic nun, right? My setting is inspired by 11th century medieval Europe, so it's obvious that I will take inspiration mostly from European fashion from that time. I will admit that there is a bit of a historical element to the design of my nun here, and that is the gamp, which is the collar that she is wearing. this piece of clothing is much more associated with, later Middle Ages and even past Middle Age nun fashion. However, I personally deem that, this piece of clothing isn't out of the technological ability of the people of that time, and this is also a fantasy world, so I am taking some liberties with fashion. And one of the main reasons why nuns at that time wouldn't be wearing such a collar cover would simply be because of lack of access to fabric. During the early Middle Ages especially, fabric was very expensive. It was throughout all of history, actually, and it only became affordable post-Industrial Revolution. People forget that cloth was woven by hand, and so it was very expensive, and so most people would only have 2 full sets of clothing at most at that time. So for nuns and priests, extra fabric simply would be, a sign of excess. But here, it makes sense, at least within the context of my world building. So, fabric is spiritually very significant. The world of Caesarella was woven by the gods, and it is basically made of the fabric of reality. So when you wear fabric, you become closer to divinity in a way. So the culture behind clothing and fabric is even more important. So for any mage, when you wear a lot of fabric, you're trying to connect with divinity and the world, and thus the origin of magic. For the nun here, the extra fabric allowed by the gape, represents that. And also the fact that it's somewhat round, softens the look of the character and makes her a little bit more friendly, which is the intent here. Another small detail that might escape the casual viewer is the length of the skirt. So the length of the skirt, you will see, is the shortest amongst every other mage, and this is for a reason. Normally nuns would also have longer skirts, but here we are taking inspiration from traditional Basque outfits. So in my world, the Sunlight Sisterhood has its origins in the Pyrenees region, at least the fantasy version of that. So mountainous region with rough terrain requires a shorter skirt. And it also gives the impression that, these sisters are working people. They're not just about standing around, studying, praying. They are also working women who are healers and midwives. In terms of color scheme, it's very simple, at least for the default sister. Entirely gray robes, silver. So obviously it's a callback to the monochrome outfit of the modern nun. But also, gray, or at least silver, is associated with the domain of light in my world. So gray, which is similar to silver, will work for this outfit. Furthermore, gray is simply a very accessible color. It's humble, and we're trying, especially here, to show off a type of mage who is low-key, humble, and not necessarily, show-offish. Because here's the thing that people might misunderstand about the medieval era, is that people love colors. They love bright colors, they love putting colors everywhere, especially if you had the means to. And oftentimes, you will see that the historical combinations of colors that people liked were very, very tacky. It looks not good because people prioritize vibrancy over, harmony. Now, onto the druid. So, the druid is also a more, humble type of mage, inspired obviously by historical druids, which had their own ties to ancient Greece and Pythagorean philosophy. So the white robes that we associate with druids, well, it's actually, Greek tunics. So in the same vein, a lot of fashion elements from the druid here are taken from Greco-Roman fashion. So the most noticeable thing is the drape. Again, even though our druid is humble, well, it's still extra fabric to indicate a higher social status, access to, more resources, which, is supposed to make sense in a fantasy world. If you're a mage, you will have advantages. People will ask for your service and you will have a more comfortable life. Because I do want to mention that in medieval society, the clothes make the man. Your social status is entirely dependent on the way you look, because you don't have we don't have internet, we don't have official IDs like today. So if you wanted to prove who you are, well, you had to look the part. So in every single design that I have here, we do have, a signature piece of clothing that will help the mage identify themselves. So for the sister, well, it's the silver robes with the guimpe. For the druid, it's the long white robe with the diagonal drape. And here, you also see that the druid also has a veil to cover her hair. And that is not only, historical, because veiling the hair was, not only for religious reasons, but for hair protection. But here, I am very much insisting on the religious aspect of covering your hair, because, again, fabric is an expression of divinity. So when you cover your hair, you are trying to get closer to divinity, since hair is believed to be an extension of your soul as an individual. So when you cover your hair, you cover your individuality to prioritize the divinity. And so here, you see me struggle a little bit with the folds. I'm really trying to get it right, because folds, clothes are the focus of this series of characters. I also do want to note that there are some Celtic inspirations on top of the Greco-Roman, so you will notice, with the face paint, and also the many Celtic knots. There are some debates about how legit, the blue face paint was historically. Luckily, this is fantasy. I don't really care. I think it looks good, and it gives the druid a more unique and wild look. Again, a way to distinguish herself from the ordinary people, so that's why I put it here. Another element is the shillelagh that I want to talk about. So every mage also has a spellcasting tool to help them. So previously for the sister, it was her rosary, so the prayer beads. Here is the staff. The shillelagh is not European, it's not medieval France, which is my main inspiration. It's actually Irish, but the Irish do not have monopoly over bonk sticks, so I took the liberty to give a shillelagh here. And so here is me also writing down in detail the elements that somewhat define each mage. For the druid, there's also the animal companion, so I wanted to show that off. And here specifically, the animal is a oak jay, since our druid here comes from the circle of the oak. Obviously, I wanted to give my druid a green sash, and this is simply because this specific druid is an earth mage, as I've written above, and from the circle of the king oak, so green is very much associated with the forest. But in my world, green isn't the only color for druids. If you have a druid who specializes in fire magic or water magic, they will wear colors that are more fitting to that. And then lastly, after everything else was colored, I'm doing the face paint. So again, there's no historical proof of face paint, it might have been actually tattoos. But here I wanted to be more face paint, and the design is supposed to recall a bit a tree. So for druids, face paint is unique to each clan. And now on to the council mage. So the previous two mages were religious type of mages, right? So no matter what, magic is divine in origin. You have people who are favored by gods and thus have more talent for magic. However, there are also many mages that approach magic with a bit more, secular belief. And so the mage rite here is very much the practical type of mage who uses magic for, daily life. So here we have a fire mage, and I wanted him to have, this practical, grounded look. So the robe is just like a typical type of tunic, maybe, of the type that is more accessible for rich people, but still just the average clothing you can find. However, there is an element of his outfit that is inspired by religious clothing, which is the capelet. So if you know, some Catholic priest will wear this kind of, more square capelet. And so we're taking the capelet here and giving it to the mage to still, offer this extra fabric, extra social status, and make it, the signature element for the mage rite. Because the mage rite is a secular type of mage, does not necessarily have a uniform, but still does have a piece of clothing that will help him distinguish himself from the average folk. In this case, the capelet, well, lore-wise, it's supposed to be unique to each person. So the cut might be similar, so it will still be, this square type of capelet with a hood, but the color, the pattern of the embroidery will be unique to each person to better represent their magic. And it will always have 6 colors. First off, well, having a lot of colors on you means that you're rich, but also it shows off that you have learned about every single type of magic out there from the 6 domains. In this case, the main color of our capelet is red, which is fire. And I also gave my mage rite a spell codex and a wand, so these are very small items that are practical that you can carry easily to show, the practical nature of the character. In terms of color, it's actually very funny because you'll see me just simply going darker in terms of skin tone. This is not intentional at all. I just find it very funny. But I did want to show off the diversity that you could find in terms of, medieval era Europe. There is this false belief that people simply did not travel, which is crazy because the Mediterranean region is extremely diverse. You had the ancient Roman Empire that, forced people to travel as policies, move soldiers around for war and to maintain peace. So you had a lot of, mixing going on and a lot of foreigners a bit everywhere. And the trend continues even after the fall of the Roman Empire. Funnily enough, I will say that the color palette for this character was a huge struggle to figure out. I knew I wanted the cape to be red. I didn't know what color I wanted to give for the tunic, and nothing seemed to work, and then I ended up settling on this burgundy with some gold trims, which I'm still not sure about it because it does make our mage here look way rich, way richer than he should be. Maybe it's just yellow and not actually gold since I didn't bother to give it a shine. And here you see me trying to figure out like a pattern that isn't too ahistorical, that actually works with, you know, Mediterranean European culture. And you might see, like, later on, I add a little extra yellow to the design, to the capelet. Mostly because I thought that the very thin yellow trim between the red and the embroidered edge was like not visible enough. So I'm giving the final little touches to the fire my mage rite is conjuring before going on to the next character, which is the Lyriker. So obviously the Lyriker is supposed to be the fantasy bard. However, we're still trying to stay within the framework of historical fashion. And I've chosen here to take inspiration from Romani culture, since Romani culture is associated heavily with, you know, music, with traveling and entertainment. And it seemed a very natural match. In this case, we are moving more and more eastward in terms of historical fashion. This outfit is very much more inspired by Byzantine culture. You can see by like rich embroideries, very bright and colorful clothing, and also the Frisian cap. So no, this is not a Smurf cap, it is actually a historical type of hat. It's the best one I could find that, you know, stayed within the framework of 11th century fashion. Because let's just say medieval hats don't get good before the 14th century. So this was the best looking one I could find, and luckily enough it does work geographically and historically, because this was present ever since the Persian Empire in the Antiquity era. So it works for the purpose of Byzantine fashion, since we're talking about, you know, Eastern Europe. And here, well, the Frisian cap takes the role of the iconic piece of clothing here. Usually Lyrikers are entertainers, so they will simply wear clothing that is fitting for their, you know, the entertainment role that they are playing, but the cap is something that they can keep no matter the role. And so this is their signature item of clothing, which comes with a pin that, you know, proves that they are actually a Lyriker. And I wanted also to associate the Lyriker mage with the domain of air, since we're talking about, you know, song and dance, which is something that depends very much on your voice and sound. And what else than birds to, you know, represent the role of a minstrel, since birds sing and also some of them dance. So this is why on the Frisian cap you will find some feathers, and I did write down the meaning of each feather to give it, you know, a little bit more world-building flavor. So in lore-wise, well, each feather is supposed to represent a form of art the Lyriker has managed to master. And so here I am working on the detailed embroideries. I will admit, I'm just not a fan. I'm not a big fan of drawing details in clothing, which is weird, I suppose, for someone who thinks so much about fashion for your characters. And now for the colors. So, well, there's not much to say about it, apart from, I guess, you know, very vibrant colors, the complete opposite of what we have for the Sunlight Sister. You know, it's supposed to be low-key, humble. Here we have an entertainer, so you have to be extremely visible, you have to be the center of attention. So yellow, orange supposed to represent that, but also in my world, well, yellow is associated with the element of air. And so here I am testing colors for the embroideries. And I do want to note that, again, I've mentioned the fact that medieval fashion is all about bright colors if you can afford it, and that's the priority. So we're not trying to harmonize the colors that much, but I am still making an effort to, not make it look completely tacky, because when you're drawing historical fashion, you'd still have to compromise somehow with our modern perception of what things are supposed to be. So, sure, I could go wild with colors and make it like a freaking mess, but it simply wouldn't be believable for the person who is looking at the design. So here, the smart way I am limiting my colors is I'm simply repeating colors. So the hoses are green, just like the embroidery and the belt. The slippers are red, just like also the embroidery. So I am making a very colorful and ostentatious design, but still keeping it somehow coherent. So here I am trying to figure out the pattern of the feathers. So one of them is a rooster tail feather with the green, and the other one, if I remember correctly, it's a pheasant. And here I am painting the musical instrument. Fun fact, musical instruments were not standardized, they were custom according to their user. So you had, unique instruments for each person. So here is why I chose to give my lyricur a dulcimer lute and not, specifically one or the other. So next up is the sahir, which simply means mage in Arabic. So one thing I wanted also to practice in this character design series was ethnic facial features. So you might have noticed that the lyricur is, a brown-skinned woman, which makes sense because she's inspired by Romani culture. And in this case, we are going to the Middle East, more specifically in the Golden Age of Islam. So obviously, the sahir is inspired by Muslim scholars of that era, hence his very studious look as he is frowning at his book. As for the outfit itself, it's a very typical set of clothing that would be worn by the average man from this era. So the long tunic, the turban, and the headscarf, these are all things that the average person would wear. However, we are still trying to give each character a unique piece of clothing. Hence, the headscarf is the equivalent to the 6-color capelet for the mage rite. So the headscarf is embroidered also in 6 colors. And we also have talismans for our mage. So there is, you can see in the sketch, there is one that goes into the turban, and there is also another one that's going around the neck. So these pieces of jewelry are here to indicate, higher social status. So I mentioned previously that when you have extra fabric in your outfit, it means that you are rich. But, obviously, jewelry is also another symbol of a higher status. And in this case, the choice of jewelry was also very deliberate. We have 2 symbols that are very culturally significant. So we have the evil eye and we have the Hamza hand, which are both believed to ward off evil. So the combination of the 6-colored headscarf, the evil eye talisman, and the Hamza hand talisman are all indicators of magehood. Also, the last indicator would be the trim on the tunic. So the outer robe here has, golden trims on the sleeve and golden trims around the collar. which are supposed to call back to the robes of a imam, which is a priest in a Muslim religion. Now, as we move on to coloring, you might have noticed something. Up until now, I have never used the color black in any of the outfits of my characters, and there is a very specific reason why. So, every domain of magic is associated with a specific color, or a set of colors. So previously we talked about the druid with her green, which is supposed to represent, the earth, the woods, which is her domain of magic. And obviously, the primary color associated with dark magic is black. However, black is perceived very differently according to the region. So in the north and the west, black is seen as a very negative color. It brings bad luck, it attracts demons, and so people avoid wearing black. And so instead of using black to represent dark magic, we use purple, as you might see on the Mage Rite cape, which we will see at the very end. However, it's not the same thing at all in the south and in the Middle East, where black is seen as a color like any other. So our Sahir here, who is a dark mage, wears a black headscarf without any hesitation. And so we also have the 6-color embroidery here. You might notice that it looks different from the end result on the left. This is because I'm trying to really represent and respect the cultural patterns that are present usually in Arabic fabrics. So usually it's a darker base with lighter embroideries on top. Still a huge pain to draw, but I guess it looks decent in the end. And next off, we have the sorcerer mercenary. So again, medieval Europe was very diverse. However, most African people Europeans would see would be mercenary warriors. So I thought the premise was very interesting, so I took that as the main inspiration for my last mage. Hence the fact that, this is the only mage who is wielding an explicit weapon. So first off, here I am doing the braids that are wavy to represent, water. And I am doing also scarification, which is a very common and present tradition within, African tribes back then. And of course, I drew every symbol for magic and wrote the meaning next to it, and even made sure to have 2 sets of symbols, one for West and East Africa, because these are 2 very different cultures. And so my water mage here is wearing on his forehead the symbols for magic and water. So one thing I do want to note about historical African fashion is that it is extremely hard to research about. Well, first off, there is very little written records, and there was also colonialism that erased a lot of its history. So the way I have decided to proceed was to look up pre-colonization outfits, and assuming that evolution of outfits wasn't too dramatic, and using simply common sense to determine, some ways of draping cloth and some ways of, cutting cloth was probably pretty, immortal, let's say, as a style. So here, the drape is inspired by kente cloth, which is a traditional Western African fashion item. However, kente cloth is a recent development that came with, after the Middle Ages, when the loom became more developed and was spread in Africa. Hence the fact that I decided to forego the complicated patterns. Well, first off, I'm very lazy. I hate embroideries, again. So instead of having patterns that are directly woven into cloth, I've decided that it would be more accessible if it was simply painted, since I did find archaeological photos of ancient African cloth that were painted. So here I am doing very complex scarification to show off the warrior status of my mage. And here, basically the kente cloth and the pattern painted upon it is representative of his mage status. Furthermore, the color here is very important. So obviously blue associated with water, but this particular shade of blue would only be possible with indigo, which is a very expensive dye. However, indigo comes from the African continent, so I believe that this would be a lot more accessible to African people than European people. So I decided to give this indigo blue to my mage as a way to show off that even though he's not necessarily wearing extra fabric or very fancy embroideries, simply by the fact of his very fancy dye, he has a higher status than everyone else. I will also mention here the particularity about hair. So in Cicerella, nobody has black hair. Why? This is a decision I made when I was 12 years old, so there was very little logic behind it, except for the fact that I wanted my main character to be the only one to have black hair. Yeah, that's it. There's no reason why. Anyways, so here, interestingly enough, the spear is not the spellcasting tool. It's actually the cloth itself, and you can see the fishing net pattern. So the way I imagine this would be that for African sorcerers, they would use their entire body to cast spells instead of simply using a single tool, and the cloth here would extend the range of their limbs, and you would have basically this mage using his clothes as a fishing net, as he would, manipulate water around him. It also simply looks cool, I think. Just one long flowy sleeve. And this is it. All 6 mages, a series of designs to answer the question, what would the average person imagine if you told them to think about one mage from each type of faction? So thank you for your time, and I will maybe see you next time.